everyone. I would like to talk to you today about a slightly off the beaten track topic, or what might be perceived as, sort of like, what is she talking about? But I believe that this topic is very, very relevant to the time that we are living in. And I do feel that there is a strong link to psychiatry or psychology. And I also think that there's a lot of hope attached to this topic, although it may not seem that way outwardly or, from the start. So I have mentioned this possibly before because when I talk about this person, he's someone that I really admire, or I really admire his work and his message. So the gentleman I'm referring to, and he really is a master, someone to really acknowledge, his name is Viktor Frankl. Now, Viktor Frankl is a Jewish man, or was a Jewish man. He was also a psychiatrist and a neurologist, and he lived during the time of World War II. And he was actually imprisoned in one of the concentration camps in Auschwitz. And he went through, one of the greatest horrors of our times, that's largely inconceivable to any of us alive today. But true horror movie stuff. Viktor Frankl was imprisoned with most of his family, his parents, his brother, as well as his wife. And over the time that he spent in his particular concentration camp, he was, of course, exposed to great atrocities. He watched dozens of people that he knew or had come to know during his time at the camp perish and die, either from the extreme weather conditions. It was bitterly cold during part of that war, and they had absolutely, no protection from the elements, and were expected to do very hard labor under very, very cruel conditions with minimal meals or nutrition. So he watched several of them perish. He also horrifyingly had to watch some being killed, and he witnessed really, really horrendous crimes. He also sadly lost both his parents. He lost his brother, and he lost his wife during his time in the concentration camp. So he became quite, alone, quite isolated, and went through difficult times psychologically and physically whilst in the camp. He also went through other, as I mentioned, he was exposed to horrendous weather conditions. So he also suffered from frostbite and various physical ailments, very serious and life-threatening serious ailments whilst he was in the concentration camp. And during his time there, being an academic and being a psychiatrist and neurologist, he did amazingly, it's just absolutely mind-boggling that he did have time, and he had the capacity, the emotional and cognitive capacity to really reflect and introspect, really, really ponder on various things that had happened to him prior to being in the camp, whilst he was at the camp, and he was observing very critically and in a very well considered introspective manner all these different events that I've described. And he started to wonder, a few things. One of the things that he wondered about is what is the difference? Is there a difference? And what is the difference between those that survive the camp and continue to survive these concentration camps versus those that seem to perish quite early on? So is there a difference, and what was the difference? Could it just be physical components or factors, or was there something more? Was this a mental game? And as he pondered and he pondered, he realized that there was a common thread that seemed to pass through those that did survive for longer and longer periods in the concentration camp. He of course Viktor Frankl, I should say, survived his time at Auschwitz, and he actually went on and wrote a book. And that book is called Man's Search for Meaning, and it is very well known. It is profound, and I definitely recommend reading it. It is quite a heavy read, very little book, very thin book, but very intense. So he did survive. But one of the observations that he did gather was that there was a common thread running through those that survived for longer and longer periods and sort of withstood the terrible physical and emotional, unbearable emotional and psychological conditions. And that thread that he picked up was around suffering. And that is why I feel it is relevant to the lockdown, and I think it is relevant to the pandemic, because there are communities and there are populations around the world that are each in their own unique manner suffering, whether you're suffering from poverty and lack of food, lack of basic necessities, whether you were suffering from emotional abuse or physical aggression, because you're in lockdown with your aggressor, with your abuser, whether you're suffering from depression, from anxiety, whatever it is, but there is wide scale suffering right now. So he wrote about suffering, and he realized, in his opinion, which I regard quite highly, his opinion is that suffering has, the fear of suffering, the anticipation of suffering, and the actual experience of suffering has immense power over its victim. However, you as the victim can overturn that power by changing the way that you perceive or you think about the suffering. And he essentially wrote that if you can find meaning somehow in the suffering, then you can overcome the suffering. And I think, I'm paraphrasing, but I think he wrote something along the lines of, if you have a strong why, if you have a strong enough why, then you can overcome any how. So in other words, if you have a strong enough desire, strong enough reason to live, if you can find a strong purpose to live, then you can overcome, or you can withstand any suffering. And so it really is a mental game. So essentially, I think the two big messages are, one, that in order to assume power again, you've got to mentally take that back from suffering. You've got to dig deep and think, what is the possible meaning of all of the suffering? Where's the meaning in all of this? How do I get through all of this? And the second thing is try and develop a very, very powerful motivation or purpose to living. And you know, purpose to life or purpose to living is a huge concept that hundreds of people have written about. Academics, philosophers, spiritual leaders, motivational speakers, ordinary people, celebrities, and so forth. So purpose to life, I mean, that's a huge topic, but I think that's going to be a huge thought, either consciously, so either people are aware of this or people are not, but it's going to come. This pandemic and this lockdown is going to evoke thoughts and questions around, what am I doing here? You know, what am I really doing here? It has, of course, already questioned a lot of people's views around how they value material goods. Because of course during the lockdown, yes, you know, if privileged people certainly have more comforts, and that makes the lockdown much easier. If you've got a large house with a beautiful garden, swimming pool, it's much easier to live in those circumstances during a lockdown than living in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment or living in a tiny 1-bedroom house in a township. So yes, privilege does play a role. And material goods do play their own part, but it also has called into question, you know, what is the meaning of all these luxuries and all these material goods that you've accumulated? Because right now, apart from bringing you some degree of comfort, it can do no more. So what is your purpose in life, and how are we going to either, you know, continue this purpose or strengthen, bolster this purpose during the lockdown? Or are we going to have to redesign, redevelop, you know, go back to the drawing board and going to evolve with the times? And that's obviously going to be a huge topic as well. How do we evolve to the times? How do we accommodate to the massive changes that have been placed on us so that we can evolve, so that we can somehow find meaning in all the suffering and come out triumphant? And that's really the big question. Thank you for listening.